In the early 20th century, a bold idea captured the Australian imagination, turning the nation's red heart into a blue inland sea. It sounds like a mirage, carving out a vast body of water in the middle of the desert. Yet for decades, this visionary scheme was taken seriously by politicians, engineers, and scientists. With each dry season, the empty salt plains of Central Australia seemed to beckon for water, whispering promises of rain, commerce, and new life. This is the true story of Australia's inland sea proposals, a tale of grand ambition tempered by hard reality. Long before these proposals, European explorers were gripped by a mythic vision of an inland sea. In the 1800s, much of Australia's interior was unknown, and many refused to believe a continent so large could lack a great central waterway. Explorer Charles Sturt famously hauled a whaleboat on his 1844 expedition, convinced he was destined to discover a great saltwater lake in the continent's centre. He and his party of men, and even 200 poor sheep, dragged their boat across scorching plains, only to find endless desert. Imagine dragging a freaking whaleboat with you through the Outback. It's kind of funny, not gonna lie, but I digress. The hoped-for ocean turned out to be a dead heart, a dry expanse where salt crusted the ground and rivers died in the sand. Sturt's failure revealed the truth. The mythical inland sea did not exist, but the dream did not die. Instead, it transformed. If nature hadn't placed a sea in Australia's interior, some wondered, could humans create one? At the turn of the 20th century, the inland sea dream found a champion in Sir Richard Baker, a prominent South Australian politician. Baker was no fringe crank, he was a respected statesman, in fact the first president of Australia's Senate and a man of science. As far back as 1883, Sir Richard Baker began investigating the idea of flooding Lake Eyre, the Great Salt Lake of the interior, with water from the Southern Ocean. Lake Eyre was an enticing candidate because its basin sits below sea level, like a giant bowl in the desert. By cutting a canal from the coast to this depression, Baker believed the sea could rush in and fill up 3,430 square miles of salt flat, altering the whole climate of Australia, as one report described his hope. In 1905, Baker published an article laying out the grand proposal and its challenges. He had already presented the idea to the South Australian Parliament years earlier, spurring surveys of the terrain. The plan was audacious. Dig a canal roughly 340 kilometres north from the Spencer Gulf at Port Augusta, passing through Lake Torrens, another large salt lake on the way, and into Lake Eyre. If successful, a vast inland sea would appear where once there was only shimmering salt and dust. Such a sea, it was argued, could increase rainfall through evaporation and even moderate the harsh inland climate. The vision was utopian. Imagine steamers sailing into the Outback, coastal rains falling on parched land, and desert rail towns transformed into port cities. Yet Baker was also a realist. By 1905, he had gathered new data and reluctantly concluded the scheme was not practical with the technology of the day. The surveys had uncovered a critical obstacle. Lake Torrens, the first basin north of Spencer Gulf, was not the convenient low path they'd hoped. Early pioneers of the scheme assumed Lake Torrens lay below sea level. Flood that lake, they figured, and it would be an easy hop to Lake Eyre. But new measurements showed Lake Torrens' bed was about 100 feet above sea level, not below it. This meant any canal from the coast would have to cut through a rise, greatly increasing the excavation required. The engineering realities began to bite. To get seawater into Lake Eyre, one estimate held that a channel at least 322 kilometres long, 12 feet deep, and over 1.6 kilometres wide would be needed. Before modern earth-moving machinery, such a project's cost was astronomical, between 151 million and £3 billion in 1905 figures, an almost inconceivable sum at the time. Baker, faced with uncertain results and a daunting price tag, urged caution. He worried that even if the canal were built, the outcome would be uncertain, and so with a mix of disappointment and practicality, Sir Richard Baker stepped back. The inland sea idea was shelved, for the moment. Don't forget to click on that subscribe button, hit the bell icon, and like this video, as it's the best way to support this channel. And if you enjoy it, consider sharing it around. Though Baker's conclusions cooled enthusiasm, they did not extinguish the dream. Over the coming decades, the idea of a lake-air inland sea resurfaced periodically, especially in times of severe drought. In the 1930s and 40s, Australians watched nations overseas undertake colossal engineering feats: the Panama Canal, the Tennessee Valley Authority dams, and later the Snowy Mountains scheme at home. If humans could divert entire rivers or dig through continental divides, why not cut a canal to lake air? One colourful advocate was Michael Sawtell, a bushman and writer who became a vocal champion of the inland sea mid-century. In the early 1950s, Sawtell argued that modern machinery and science could succeed where the 1880s pick and shovel era had failed. He pointed optimistically to new discoveries in harnessing tidal power and cloud seeding, imagining lake air as a giant climate engine. A field lake air, Sawtell wrote, would generate the raw material to produce the clouds through massive evaporation, clouds that scientists from the CSIRO could then make burst into rain. Such was the post-war faith in human ingenuity that even making rain to order seemed within reach. Sawtell dreamed of Central Australia blooming, even musing that one day Alice Springs might become the new capital city of Australia, fed by the bounty of an inland sea. Government bodies and scientific societies took note. The Royal Geographical Society sent expeditions to study Lake Eyre's basin. In 1950, researchers like geographer Charles Bonnyathan even navigated a boat across the lake during a rare flood, in part to evaluate its potential. Army surveyors and aerial mapping had vastly improved knowledge of outback topography by the 1950s. Supporters of the scheme argued that what was impossible in Baker's day might be achievable now with bulldozers, dynamite and modern pumps. But the skeptics remained as well. Engineers continued to warn that evaporation, the very thing supposed to bring rain, would be the project's bane. In the searing heat of outback Australia, Lake Eyre can evaporate 100 inches or 2,500 millimeters of water a year. That is an enormous amount of water loss. Any sea would rapidly shrink without constant inflow. Critics pointed out that salt buildup could quickly clog a canal and turn the new sea into a dead salt marsh. And then there was the question, would it actually make it rain? Later studies suggested the effect of a permanent lake on regional rainfall would be modest at best. When Lake Eyre filled naturally in 1974, a scientific study found it altered precipitation only up to about 50 kilometers around the lake. Such findings reinforced the skepticism that had shadowed the inland sea dream from the start. Even as Lake Eyre schemes were debated, another visionary plan emerged. One aimed not at bringing the ocean inland, but diverting the rivers themselves. Its author was Dr. John Bradfield, one of Australia's most celebrated engineers. Bradfield had already etched his name in history as the designer of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. By the late 1930s, with the bridge complete, he turned his inventive mind to a new challenge: drought-proofing the interior. What he conceived was epic in scope. Announced in 1938, the Bradfield scheme proposed to capture the floodwaters of North Queensland's coastal rivers and send them flowing westward over the Great Dividing Range into Australia's arid centre. Bradfield had been struck by the fact that enormous volumes of monsoonal rain in the north simply ran out to the Coral Sea each year, while inland Queensland and beyond suffered chronic droughts. His plan would flip nature's script. By building a series of dams, tunnels and canals, Bradfield aimed to divert rivers like the Tully, Herbert and Burdekin away from the ocean and into the thirsty interior. Instead of spilling uselessly into the Pacific, these waters would be channeled into the Flinders and Thomson rivers, and even towards Lake Eyre in South Australia. The scheme promised to create over 3,000 square miles of irrigated farmland in the outback, turning desert into breadbasket. Even more boldly, Bradfield suggested that filling the dead heart with water might alter the climate, much like the Lake Eyre proposal. Increased humidity from a new inland water body could induce rain and temper the heat. Bradfield's credentials lent weight to the idea. Here was no armchair theorist, but the man who spanned Sydney's harbour with steel. He meticulously drafted maps and engineering plans for the diversion. On paper it looked feasible. Highland reservoirs would gravity feed water through mountains via tunnels and down long canals to the interior. Enthusiasts hailed it as a nation-building vision, a Snowy Mountains scheme for Queensland ahead of its time. By bringing water to the interior, Australia could support new settlements, expand agriculture, and realise the old dream of making the inland flourish. From the late 1930s into the 1940s, the Bradfield scheme and the lake air inland sea concept were hotly debated in newspapers and government halls. Supporters painted them as visionary solutions to Australia's perennial drought problem. A bold nation could seize control of its fickle climate and make the desert bloom. There was a strong current of nation-building optimism in the air. As one commentator of the era noted, the success of grand projects like the Snowy Mountains Hydro Scheme, commenced in 1949, showed that modern mechanisation can do wonders, digging great channels and driving tunnels, feats once unimaginable. Why then not apply that know-how to Central Australia? Politicians from inland constituencies, business magnates, and even military strategists, some saw strategic value in an inland sea or more populated interior, lent an ear to these ideas. The fact that respected figures like Sir Richard Baker and Dr. John Bradfield endorsed such schemes meant they had to be taken seriously, not dismissed as wild fantasies. Yet for all the excitement, expert scrutiny revealed serious flaws. Hydrologists and meteorologists pored over Bradfield's river diversion figures. In 1947, a technical study delivered sobering news. Bradfield had vastly overestimated how much water the northern rivers could provide. Using only limited rainfall records, and even a barometer on horseback to gauge elevations, he hadn't accounted for how much water would be lost or simply wasn't there to begin with. In fact, later analysis showed his projections were roughly double the actual flows available. The proposed dams and channels would likely run dry in drought years. Economists also warned that the scheme's cost would be far higher than first thought, potentially running into billions of dollars, and that's mid-20th century dollars. For a nation recovering from the Depression and facing World War II, such resources were unthinkable. The Bradfield scheme quietly lost momentum, receiving only intermittent political support in subsequent decades and never full backing from any government. Scientific skepticism likewise dogged the Lake Air Sea proposal. As knowledge of desert hydrology improved, critics pointed out that a man-made inland sea might create more problems than it solved. Evaporation and salinity were the twin spectres. Each year the sun could suck up a lake's worth of water, leaving behind vast quantities of salt. One analysis noted that a permanent lake air sea would precipitate on the order of 90,000 tonnes of salt annually as it evaporated, a logistical nightmare for maintenance and a potential ecological disaster. There was also the question of what happened downwind. Would increased humidity bring rain, or just more oppressively hot, sticky weather? By the 1960s and 70s, meteorologists had tools to model such scenarios, and the answers were not encouraging. Any rainfall enhancement would likely be very localised and slight. The grand vision of greening all of Central Australia with one big lake was, alas, a mirage, much like the fabled inland sea of the explorers. Looking back, it's easy to cast these inland sea schemes as mere follies or footnotes. After all, neither the Lake Air Canal nor the Bradfield water diversion was ever built. But in their time, these proposals were far from fringe fantasies. They were rigorously explored by some of the nation's best minds. Government commissions, Royal Geographical Society committees, and university scientists all grappled with the concept, weighing dream against danger. The fact that Australians kept returning to the inland sea idea, again in the 1980s, 2000s, and even as recently as the 2020s, when politicians resurrected Bradfield's plan, shows its enduring allure. The inland sea represents, in a way, the eternal Australian hope of taming the outback, of conquering distance, drought, and desert with engineering prowess and sheer will. In the end, nature held the cards. The harsh environment and complex water systems of Australia defied the simplistic solutions that an inland sea seemed to offer. The visionary ambition ran up against geologic reality, hard rock and higher ground where canals would go, climate systems not so easily altered by a single giant lake, and waters that were already vital where they flowed. One later critique noted that taking water from coastal rivers would rob those ecosystems and communities, causing harm elsewhere. Bit by bit, the grounded skepticism won out over the grandiose plans. Instead of inland seas, Australia pursued more modest but feasible water schemes, like the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme and numerous smaller irrigation projects. Though unrealised, Australia's inland sea proposals left a captivating legacy. They were products of their era, times when no dream seemed too big. In the early 1900s, Baker's Canal plan showed the optimism of a young federation willing to consider continental engineering. By mid-century, Bradfield's scheme embodied the post-war ethos of nation building. Both faced a healthy skepticism of those who demanded evidence and practicality, a tension between bold vision and hard facts that is the hallmark of progress. And so the story of Australia's would-be inland sea lives on as a fascinating what-if of history. We can almost picture it. Had things gone differently, by the 1960s saltwater might have lapped at desert dunes where camels once trod, and canal locks might have raised ships up the Outback slopes. Perhaps summer storms would have gathered over that internal sea, spilling rain over new farms on its shores. Or perhaps not. As many warned, it could have become an ecological misadventure. What is certain is that the idea was seriously entertained by leaders at the highest levels, and investigated by engineers and scientists who ultimately, and probably wisely, advised against it. Hope you found this as interesting as I did, and as always, thanks for watching. Before I end this video, I'd like to give a big shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members. Thank you so much to everyone that helps to support this channel.